right. So we can wait for a few viewers here.
Of course.
To show up.
How have you been doing, Angel?
Been doing well, considering. Thanks for asking.
Yeah.
But yeah, how about yourself?
Doing pretty good. Pretty excited to be here. Well, this is my first live stream, so.
Oh, I didn't know that. But,
a little bit nervous, but you know.
Nah, don't be nervous. It'll be fine. We're gonna wait a little bit and let folks filter in. Yeah, it was pretty cool, that little countdown thing. But
yeah.
All right, let's. I'll tell you what. Let's give it like 2 minutes, and then we'll jump in. I'm really excited to be speaking about monorepos today. It's going to be pretty fun.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too. So actually, let me ask you this. Like, we don't have to get started, but you know, to sort of set the stage. Among all the sort of you know, when people are using CircleCI, among all the questions or features they're asking for, where would you rate, like, where would you put monorepos? Like, you know, high on that list, somewhere in the middle, bottom?
Yeah, no, I think I have to say, like, as far as my interactions, you know, it's different from like a support engineer or something like that. But I would say it's probably more low on the list. But right, like, there's varying degrees of interest. And I think it's based on, to be honest, like post conferences, you know, like, oh, they're doing it this way at whatever company, so let's look at it. And then they realize, like, oh, that's not a, you know, they're probably not in that monorepo kind of mindset.
Yeah.
And it depends, right? So, and I think we'll get into that a little bit.
Yeah.
So, all right. I'm going to give it to 1 more minute, and then I'm just going to jump in, introduce you, and we'll get to hacking. This is the fun part.
All right, let's do it.
All right, brother. So, yeah, you're in San Francisco, yeah?
Yeah, I'm about 5 minutes from, or no, 15 minutes from San Francisco. Not too far.
How's the fires and stuff? Any impact on you?
Very interesting. So we live slightly away from San Francisco, so up a hill. The smoke isn't too bad up here. However, I don't know if you saw the apocalypse day last week, where everything was orange. People were posting photos everywhere. I think our entire backyard, everything was full. Yeah, it was not as bad, but yeah, it was orange. Like the whole day was like 9 p.m. Everything everything which is outside is filled with ash, so it's crazy.
Yeah, that's what happens when you have fires. All right, well,
I mean, it's never been this bad.
Yeah.
All right, perfect.
Let's go ahead and get started. I mean, you know, we're here to do some hacking. So I want to start off by welcoming our guest today, is Roopak, and your last name is massive. So I'm going to let you pronounce it so I don't butcher it real quick.
Venkatakrishnan.
There you go. Yeah. See, if I were to sit down and practice it, I would have got it, and I apologize for that.
No,
but so our friend Roopak here, he's a community contributor to CircleCI, specifically the Orbs project, and he has some deep knowledge into monorepos. Roopak has worked at companies such as Google, Twitter, and he now works at Bolt as a staff software engineer. And he and I have been going back and forth for a few weeks about how he can basically, you know, I was interested in having some community folks come in, developers, and definitely Roopak was on top of the list because he's always contributing. And I wanted to highlight some of the work he's been doing today, especially in, like I said, the Orbs realm. So Roopak, yeah, that was my kind of hokey introduction about you. So let's take a few minutes for you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who Roopak is, what he's doing, and one thing about CircleCI, we like to do a little thing about fun facts, and I forgot to tell you that, so I'm putting you on the spot. But if you have one fun fact to share, it could be anything, right? No pressure. So go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll get into what we're going to talk about today.
All right. Okay. So my name is Roopak, as Angel mentioned, and I'm an engineer at Bolt. So Bolt does online checkout. So we're actually, like we like to use the term perfecting checkout. So if you're trying to buy stuff online, I know most people usually tend to go to Amazon, but as you go to other stores, we like to make that checkout experience a lot better. So yeah, if you want to work on some really interesting problems, hit me up, and there's a lot of opportunities at Bolt. That's sort of my plug there. So prior to Bolt, I was at Spoke, another startup in the Bay Area, which does online ticketing. I did a lot of infrastructure and backend work there. And before that, I was at Google and Twitter before that. So been around a little bit. Yeah. And let me see, fun fact. Okay, I can track certain kinds of deer by their dung. I used to live in Botswana, and when I was in the 4th grade, they took us on a school camping trip of sorts, and one of the skills that they taught us was to look at dung and track kinds of animals. I think I don't know how much of it I remember. I do remember all the rules because they drilled it into us. I mean, how fresh is it? How fresh is it? But bunch of steps. So I don't know how good I would be at it, but I learned to do it.
That sounds like a cool startup app we should make. Track deer dung. So, wait a minute. That fun fact is a little intriguing to me. So, was it for you to kind of track the animal so you can hunt it, or was it just to know what kind of deer are in the area? I mean,
I guess it was mostly to see if there were a lot of animals nearby or far. So the main thing they taught us to look at what direction was the animal moving and how far it could possibly be. If it's fresh, it's probably closer, and you can track the direction by seeing the way it's laid out. So.
And the only reason I asked was I was in the military and been through some training, and they taught us similar to that, but not for the same reason. That's what All right. So today we want to jump in and talk about monorepos, which is something that I admittedly don't have much experiences with, other than prior to maybe a couple decades prior, when everything was more monolithic in nature as far as code goes and deployments. It's similar in my mind to that, right? You have one application or a bunch of applications in one kind of version control system. And since you worked at Google and Facebook, I'm sorry, disregard Google and Twitter. Those companies, and I haven't worked there, but I know tons of folks that have worked there or currently working there. And the way they describe their software development practices, you write code, and as soon as you commit it, it's basically pushed into the production mainline trunks, right? So you're always contributing to the projects and to the source code. So what we're going to talk about today is monorepos, and talk about some of your experience, since you actually have a lot more experience with monorepos than myself. What the advantages and disadvantages were at these different places.
Yeah, so it's actually, I think if you look up monorepos online, you're not going to find people in the middle. You're going to find people who are it's an absolute yes, right, or you're going to find people who are it's an absolute no, right? And I think I wouldn't fall in either camp, right? I like to think of it as what is sort of going to be best for the situation you're sort of in, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. There are a couple of places where some of the advantages, so we moved to a monorepo at Bolt, And the reasons that we sort of ended up going that way is we were not truly multi-repo where we had many repos, many tiny repos where everybody was contributing. We had two giant repos, and it turned out that we didn't really have the benefits of a multi-repo, neither did we have the benefits of a monorepo. And there were a couple of other things over there, and like the team collectively made a decision to move over. I think this was the same case at Twitter, right? It was they had many repos, but they had like two main repos, and I think there's an article somewhere you can go find out about how Twitter moved to a monorepo.
Right.
I will say, when people talk about monorepos and talk about big companies, it's true. Like Google, Twitter, I think even Facebook uses a monorepo. However, they also have a huge team to manage this. They also have a lot of scale. Their Git repositories or things are like, Google doesn't even use Git. Like if you look at their paper, they have their own, version control system. Like you can't use Git at that scale. Right. It's not even going to work. You can't download all the code. So like for smaller companies, it's like somewhat different, right? Like one of the big things that people don't like about monorepos is the repository is huge. It's difficult to check out everything. May not apply to a smaller company, which is a couple of years old. Doesn't really matter. That problem is not going to happen for a while. So
you had asked me earlier, like what my experience has been regarding like CircleCI clients or users or community members asking about monorepos, right? Like what kind of interest is it, or there is in it? It's funny because it depends. Like I told you earlier, it depends on if those folks have been at a conference recently, because generally that's when the questions around monorepo, the interest around monorepos and CircleCI kind of peak. And generally, when I'm speaking to these folks, they're usually startups, right? Or folks in maybe a smaller kind of company trying to future-proof themselves against not having a monorepo, right? Like, so it's like that whole Kubernetes versus using some services, other services, right? Like maybe ECS or something like that, right? Like, at what point do we grow into, grow into using those technologies? And the other question is, should we be using those practices or those technologies? And I think monorepos kind of falls in that same genre of future-proofing is what I call it, right? So like we're a startup. If monorepos is hot today when we're starting, we should build towards that, right? Like implement that and build towards that with the hopes that our infrastructure will kind of put that out, which in my mind is kind of like, well, why would you do that? You don't know the future, right? Like maybe having disparate repos is the way to go.
Maybe. I think that question is like really hard to answer, right? Like the other context where I've heard monorepos, like I saw a company where they considered themselves monorepos, but they had like a set of monorepos. And, it's very interesting because they had I think Uber has this. They have a Go monorepo. So there's a monorepo just for Go code. All of their Go code is in one repo, but they have other repos for other things. So I saw a startup where they had all their JavaScript/Node in one repo, which is fair. They were like, we're going to use Lerna, we're going to use NPM, and everything is going to be standard across this one repo. We have the lint rules. Nobody else can change them, which is important. Like you want to have the same lint rules across. JavaScript is weird as is. So.
Well, I think so monorepo can mean many different things to many different people, just like any other technology concept, right? Like you go to any other, one company does it monorepos their way and the other one does it their way, right? And they're probably in that gray area to be realistic. But like you did have some we were talking earlier. You did have some kind of slides or kind of discussion around what a I would say there are some commonalities, right? So can you start like sharing some of that information you have around the common the monorepo implementations that are most common? Does that make sense?
I don't think I have slides for that, but we can just talk about it. I did have like some slides later on where I want to talk about like how we do.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, I think like
maybe I should just rephrase the question. So do you have like from your experience. Again, I've been using monorepos for most of my career, but I don't think in this, the automation wasn't there that we have today. So, we had multiple features or services inside of a monolithic repository, right? And yeah, we were, cosmetically organizing everything in folders, right? Which I think is today how most monorepos work. But we didn't have the tooling we have today, right? To kind of leverage, traversing all the folders and then being able to automate a lot of the processes that we do today. It was just literally, hey, run this script that knew where to go to get things in process. So can you talk about like more of the common pattern, I guess is what I'm asking about, that you've seen when people are implementing monorepos, and then we can jump into like showing off some of the work you've done, man.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, like I've seen like at this point like 3 different things across. I don't know. I've talked to like 10 companies and like been doing some audits, right?
Sure.
There's of course the multi-repo approach where they just like break up services, have a bunch of repos, and then there's some stuff in common. Then there's the Google, Facebook, Uber style monorepo, which is like everything goes here. Nothing is
right.
Like nothing is sort of in a separate repo. And then like at Bolt, it's almost like that, except like if you're prototyping something, you wouldn't put it in the monorepo, because like one of the rules that we have is if it's going to go in, it has to be tested. You can't just check in random code into the repo.
Right.
You want to make sure that everything's tested and it can be deployed to production, sort of. So if you're prototyping, some mobile app for some particular thing, you would not put it in the monorepo. You would test it out, make sure it's good, and then you would break it up and somehow bring it back in. And then the other things, yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And the other way that I've seen is people having a monorepo per kind of language sort of thing, like, Node, Go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And it seems like the first 2 you mentioned are more about speed, right? Like just get it in there. Obviously the middle one where you said prototyping doesn't go in, right?
Yeah.
How do you like, what's the decision point in create, streamlining that at some point, right? Merging that into your mainline repo or process, I should say.
Yeah, I this is hard, right? Like we talked about it quite a bit, at least at Bolt when we did it. And we were like, when someone wanted to do something new, the first thing they would ask is, should we just put it directly in the monorepo, or should we like make a prototype and then, we'll decide later. And then depending like on that particular case, right? Like for example, someone's prototyping, a mobile app right now. And so we were like, yeah, we have no idea where this is going to go.
Exactly.
We're exploring 15 different directions, and we don't want you to be blocked on reviews, on setting up a build pipeline. Like one of the things that I have, like we structured I spent some time structuring the CircleCI monorepo checks that you cannot even get in code into our repo unless there are tests, like sort of like you need to have some tests, otherwise it won't even allow you to merge. And I'll be talking about that. But so we were like, yeah, do a separate repo, get it working, and then we'll see what needs to happen after that. So. Gotcha.
That makes sense. I mean,
you need a scratch case.
Yeah, at some point you can't have just injecting junk into the whole process. But right. I mean, anyway, that's interesting, and definitely look into some more of that myself just to see like what people are doing, because it is becoming more of a popular kind of concept amongst software development teams.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I was gonna like talk about the hard part of it for a sec. Basically, if you are on a monorepo, like you have to remember that you don't want the more and more data you start checking in, the bigger the repository becomes. And if it's like too huge, that's when, people who talk about like, hey, like, monorepos are a problem. That's when you start getting there. I mean, I don't think we're anywhere close, but
yeah. Cool, man. So now that we kind of touched base on monorepos, let's look at some the work you've been doing. I know that again, in our development community or developer community, we get the question though, right? I would say it's not as prevalent as you would think, but we do get the question, and that's why I wanted to invite you on and talk about kind of the work you've been doing, because I know you had created an orb. And for those of the folks that don't know what an orb is, CircleCI has a, well, inherently most CI tools right now, modern day tools, don't really have a good way to reduce code reuse, or reduce the amount of syntax in code, and also a mechanism for reusing capabilities that already exist, right? So that leads to, again, a lot of repeated code, redundant syntax and configurations, which then make those files huge and hard to manage. What we did at CircleCI was we enabled our backend platform to allow for parameterized YAML, so to speak, right? So you can actually, you have a domain structure that you can start creating parameters within your YAML, and the system understands that and can streamline that into the build process, right? So it'll compile it down, and it'll understand how to implement those values for those parameters into stubbed out pieces inside of your config file. So when we decided to go that route and implement orbs and release it to the public, we also allowed for a registry, so that everything's kind of kept in one place, right? So people can just do one-stop shopping, modifications, and maintenance. Roopak, as a community member, has built one called a Swiss Army knife. Is that right?
Yeah, I call it Swiss knife, but yeah.
Swiss knife. I'm sorry, Swiss. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, so I wanted to bring Roopak on to kind of show us, the orb and how it works, and tell us a little bit about why he built it and some of the problems that it solves. I'm super interested in doing this. So Roopak, I'm going to go ahead and put you up. If you want to share your screen, please feel free to do that.
Right. Yeah, so let me maybe start off at the orb, and then we'll sort of bring over here, and we'll talk about how the Monorepo is set up, right? I think technically, right, like people are going to talk about, hey, how the base use case for orbs that we originally started with when I started this was that we had many repos, and we really wanted to share code across the many repos, and that's why I started making an orb. And then I started talking to people at other places, and we realized everybody needs to be sharing some of the base code, especially for monorepo setup. Like everybody's trying to do the same thing, and it becomes harder. And I think the hardest part of setting up a monorepo is either you have a build system like Bazel, which Google open sourced. I think there's Buck by Facebook, all of which calculate which build targets change, which of them you sort of want to run tests for. And that sort of was the thing when we needed this at Bolt as well. And then I noticed some other people need it. So over a weekend, we sort of, I sort of hacked together this command that sort of does everything, except I'm not gonna sit and walk you through the commands here. I'm sort of gonna take you through, where a blog post where I sort of wrote about how this happens. Angel, as I walk through it, if you have any question, let me know, and I'm gonna maybe zoom in so that it's
actually. If anybody watching has any questions, please feel free to post them, and we will stop and answer any of your questions regarding monorepos and anything you have any interest in. So please, audience participation is encouraged.
Yeah. So I'm gonna get started and explain sort of how we set this up. So basically, SwissKnife has a command where you get to say, hey, if these folders are modified, if any one of these folders are modified, run a workflow. So Circle, as everybody knows, sort of works on the notion of pipelines, and each pipeline can have multiple workflows. So this is the way the SwissKnife Orb sort of works. I'm just going to go into the main part of it, right? This is where the meat of the user definition is. I mean, under the hood, SwissKnife does a bunch of the logic and parsing and git checking for all this. But basically, I say if the client's directory or the shared directory is modified, run a client workflow. If the server directory is modified or the shared directory is modified, run the server workflow. And finally, if the operations directory is modified, we should run the operations workflow. So once you define this, the way that no, not here. So once you define this, the way that it all works is you push a branch, and automatically, Swiss Knife runs this command, figures out what is modified, and then runs the corresponding workflows. In this case, I could have probably put a better screenshot. I modified code in all three, so it ran all three. But if I had modified only code inside the client's repo, it would have skipped running the operations and server tests. So this basically lets you run only what is modified. And okay, one, you get to save on your credits, and two, your build pipeline is really fast. I think that's one of the things that everybody really cares about, right? You want your builds to be done fast, and you don't want to test something that doesn't matter. That's sort of where we ended up.
Yeah. So one of the things with CircleCI, actually, I think it's inherent in most automation, or CI automation, is folks automate, especially when they're getting started. They automate things, right? This is the kind of the pattern I see is they start automating things, and to get their feet wet. Once they get familiar with the tool, they start doing kind of performance checks, right, and metrics on how long builds are happening or are taking to accomplish, and then they start looking at the build pass-fail rates, right, all those things, which are really important, because you definitely want to fine-tune your development processes. And one of the things that I definitely see folks doing is having a misunderstanding of the structure within these CI tools. You know what I mean? And what I mean by that is, let's say, I would say the lowest object in a CI tool is a command, right? Like, you're going to execute something, right? And then the next layer up would be a grouping of those commands. So that could be like a step, which is what we have in CircleCI. Then you go up to the next level, which would be a job, right? So that's a grouping, a grouping of jobs, and then a step, because that's a grouping of your jobs. And then you go up another level from job to workflows, where workflows in CircleCI's platform is a way to orchestrate your jobs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you're doing here is because CircleCI enables you to have multiple workflows, which will kick off at the same time once your build starts at CircleCI, when you change some code. So that gives you the ability to manage, I guess, the monorepo better. So the pattern that I'm assuming you're going to show us is you have a repository, and then you have maybe, like you said, I saw a client there. So you have maybe a web service or some kind of service in one folder. Then in another folder, you have maybe the front end to that service, right? Like the client. So now you can keep everything in one repository and then run your automation against those different folders. And you're leveraging workflows, it looks like, to do this, right?
Yeah, I'm leveraging one workflow per what do you call a service? I mean, I'm guessing there are other ways to sort of do this. I just felt that at some point you'll need, so at least when I talk to a couple of folks, it turns out that even for client, let's say React, you want to do a lint, you want to do tests, you want to do dependency checks. So it turns out that commands would be serial and workflow could have parallel jobs. So I want workflow there.
No, and so
yeah.
I mean, you're right. There's always different ways to skin a cat, right? Like, you can do it many different ways.
Yeah.
But I just want to kind of stress that in our platform, workflows is an orchestration of jobs. And it's nice because you can actually even add parameters, right, to then leverage the same job and just change out the folder, right? That could be one way
100%.
of doing it, right?
Yeah.
But And I just wanted to kind of clarify for people who are watching who are not familiar with monorepos. They can get like I said, they don't. It's not like one size fits all, right? There's multiple flavors of that, and it all depends on the team and the company you're working with and how they implement this monorepo pattern or strategy. So yeah, man, jump into some of that code.
Yeah.
And could you zoom in a little bit more, please?
Yeah. Let me zoom in, and let's actually just get directly into the code. I'm going to sort of walk people through. Is this big, adding to Angel's point, like one of the biggest negatives of monorepos, or one of the things to keep in mind is that if you are to implement a monorepo, the person who takes care of the monorepo has a lot of work. What previously used to be split among a bunch of people now goes to sort of that team or that person who maintains the monorepo.
That was going to be one of the kind of disadvantages I was going to bring up, but yeah, glad you mentioned that, because yeah, for sure, like that's a big task, and a tall order, right, to ask folks to do. And yeah, it requires some a little bit of planning and resource allocation outside of that. So
yeah. So okay, I'm gonna this is like a dummy repo. There's actually no client, server, and operations code. It's just like made as an example for Circle. So I'm gonna quickly walk you guys over things. So there are three directories. There are clients directory, operations, server. Oh, 4 directory: clients, operations, server, and shared. All of them have run tests. Basically, it doesn't run any test. It just says the script would run client test, operation tests, server, and shared tests. And so now let's sort of go back, right? So if we made a job, and we did exactly what Angel said. We took a parameter. So basically, this run test job takes a parameter that is the directory. Then I'll talk about this in a bit, but let's ignore this for now, and then let's just go directly to what it does. It goes into the directory, and then it just calls the run test commands, which in your case, like your run tests could run JavaScript tests, or it could run Go test if you're running Go tests. So this is basically the main job that we have, and this is the entry point for all of Swiss Knife's magic monorepo support. I call it magic, not really. It's just a bunch of code. So basically tell it exactly what you want to do. So base branch is, against what branch should it diff for the code. So let's say you make 2 commits. It's going to look against like your 2 commits on, let's say my branch is Roopak feature A. It's going to look at how many commits on Roopak feature A against master. And then it's going to, I'll come back to this in a bit again, slightly more. Once we understand the base working, then it's going to become a little simpler. And then here you define workflows, what workflows to run. And we'll see this as we go into client or server workflows, and anything in the operations directory runs the operation workflow. And as we go into what each workflow does, I'll explain this point. And so here, if you see, we have a workflow for each of them, right? Client tests runs, we call the run test job with the clients directory, and then the run test job with the shared directory. So this is for client tests, and similarly for server tests. And finally, operations calls the operations one. And this is the actual job for the trigger needed workflows entry point. So by default, we say don't run the client flow, don't run the server flow, the operations, and only run the trigger flow. So every time you push a branch, let's actually do this, right? Let's actually go ahead, and I'm gonna, is this sort of, maybe I could make it a little bigger.
Yeah, just Command plus some more, man. I think you could hit it a lot more if you can. There you go. That's
okay,
good.
Perfect. Let's see if this is, there we go. So let's check out a branch. Right? We don't have anything on this branch. Let's just modify, let's modify the shared one, because this would run 2 workflows. This would be fun. Echo So we say CircleCI live stream, and this guy is modified. So if I do a git status, that's it would come up with and this should push it up. So, okay. So now let's sort of go ahead and then see how this looks. So as soon as you push, you see that that commit runs trigger needed workflows, which is the which is going to be the Swiss knife command. So it's going to clone up your repo, and it's going to notice where we changed code. In this case, we changed code in the shared, which means according to the crazy map we have here, it's going to run the server workflow and the client workflow. And you can see what Swiss knife does under the hood, which sort of explains this. So it says files modified for run server workflow. So the files that we're looking for the server workflow are anything in the shared or server workflow. So there is one. So it says I'm going to run the server workflow. Similarly, it did the same thing for the client workflow. So it also going to run the client workflow. So it decides to run the client and the server workflows, right? And then it doesn't rerun the trigger flow. Otherwise, that would trigger another workflow, which we don't want to have. And then it triggers this. So let's go here. You will notice that right after this, it ran the server and the client workflows, right? Both of them are running. I mean, like, these are just like normal workflows. They don't really do anything. Like, this would run the shared test, and then it's like, here's the comment that we added.
So I guess my question is, and you probably already covered this, but like, so how you engineered the orb to detect changes in a specific area? Can we look back in some of that code and and you know, what I'm interested in learning about, I guess, or I'm a little confused about, is how, you know, once that push was committed and CircleCI triggers this build based off of this configuration file, there's obviously a way to tell, right, what's changed. And maybe I missed it, but could you show the I guess the detection mechanism you're using?
Yeah.
To kind of trigger, right? Because obviously then you would have,
so this is all bundled in the orb. Basically, so you know the regex that we had over here?
Yeah. Right.
So we just take the regex, and then the orb sort of just does a git diff against the base branch. And then passes it to your regex to see if anything matches. And the reason that I had divergence point is basically, I'll sort of explain this. Someone opened an issue, and that's why I added this parameter. In general, like, if your repository is moving fast, you would have branched off of master at commit A. By that time, commit B, C, and D have been added. So when you diff, you don't want to see what are the difference between your, you don't want to see what the difference is between, you want to see what the difference is between your commits and A, because that's where you branched off, what I call the divergence point. However, some people actually cared on looking the difference between the committed code and the latest commit as well. I didn't understand the use case completely, but I was like, it's a parameter. I'll add it for you. Why not? So, you know,
got you.
By default, I think everybody would probably want to use a divergence point, which is basically you find where your branch diverged. So we run some code to say, we find out where you diverged from the base branch, which can be, you know, I think nowadays people are going for main. So main or master, and, you know, head, and then we run a regex, and, you know, we find the files that have been modified. And we added support for Perl as well. I think some people were not happy with grep being enough. I think people had more complicated regexes. So we actually had someone who was like, my regex is really complicated, and, you know, grep is not enough. So we were like, okay, we're adding Perl support now. So we added that, and I think
so you're using Perl as well to, It's a great stack for especially for string manipulation. Yeah. It's so I'm an old Perl monger from way back, so that's good to know.
I'm not gonna lie. I had a really hard. I've never done Perl before. It was only for this orb. It took me quite a bit of like finagling to make sure I got it right. But yeah, so there's a Perl option as well. By default, though, it's just grep because most people just need these directories or those.
Right, sure. And it's supported across pretty much all systems for the most part. So.
Yeah. So far, I think I've talked I think the CircleCI Orb in itself is used by like about 48 to 49 orgs. The last I tested, I know that at least 7 people, 7 different companies have reached out about using this particular thing in some way or the other. So that much I know. I know someone who's using it directly on a Mac-based workflow system. I haven't heard of Windows yet, so I'm assuming it'll work. But again, I haven't done coding on Windows in a while, so I'm not even sure. I haven't tested, but should work.
So before we move forward, I just wanted to kind of highlight that this, for the folks that are not familiar with orbs or CircleCI, this is what I was talking about regarding encapsulation and trying to make things easy on developers, right, and organizations using the platform. What Roopak has done here is basically created a reusable and actually pretty flexible and feature-rich orb, which enables you to do exactly what he says there, right? So if you look at the file name at the top, it's trigger workflows for all modified. That's amazing. I got to say, the fact that you have the capability to use an orb to trigger automation and then effortlessly figure out what had changed and then take operations against that. It's pretty amazing. I really I didn't realize how deep in you went, to be honest. But this is pretty cool stuff, man, because not only can you use this with monorepos, you can pretty much use this for any kind of changes, right?
You can use it even in a giant, even if you don't use monorepos at all and you just have a lot of code, if you have a lot of code, you don't want to be testing all of it. You sometimes know that some code doesn't need to be tested if something else is modified. So someone they were telling me that they use something like there are a bunch of other things here, very similar commands, which are basically if README files are modified, don't run tests. I don't want to wait. And I was like, that's a fair argument.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, go for it.
No, I was just going to say I'm impressed with, especially with what you've done here regarding, just kind of orchestrating. Again, you're orchestrating the workflows, you're orchestrating the automation to a more refined level. Like at CircleCI, the basic pattern is, just run this workflow and then these jobs. And we do have we've added within the YAML now, you also have these
conditionals,
the logic, a little bit of logic, right? So you can kind of control when things happen based on some certain criteria. Now, of course, it's not, again, YAML is, and that's the one thing people don't understand, is YAML is not a programming language, right? It's a data structure. And, as much as we want to hack it to be a programming language, it's just not that. But at CircleCI, we understand that that's the main vehicle for people to interact with our platform. Outside of, you can leverage the APIs now as well. But this is the way that it's most commonly used. And then bringing that orb in to even take more advantage of the parameterization capabilities is pretty impressive. So I'm sorry, I want you to keep hacking. Let's just go down, pick up where you left. That was a long-winded question I asked. And by the way, if anyone here has any questions, please, or watching, please ask questions because we're here to answer and engage.
Yeah. So, okay, at this point, I can talk about some other things that you have to think about when you set up a monorepo. I think one of the things for us was how do you know when a branch is ready to merge, especially when you have different set of repos. And like I had an explanation for this. I haven't really written up a blog post, though I've been sort of meaning to. We can sort of get into that, or I could talk more about various different commands here and sort of what they mean. Any suggestions?
No, go into what you're. Can you zoom that in a little bit too? So.
This is okay. Yeah. So if people haven't visited, you can probably. I mean, I ended up buying a domain name because this URL is very hard. You can just go to orb.swissKnife.dev, and this actually just brings you here. And I have,
nice.
I have very, very, very slowly started writing documentation for the orb. I will say though, I've documented 3 commands, and there are I don't know, a lot more commands.
There's a ton. I saw that. Yeah.
So,
but I tell you what, since you have so much content here, let's pick like the top 3 or 5 that you want to kind of you think will be most commonly used, right? And then then they can reach out to us if they need any other help with the other ones.
So I think these 2 are really, really used. I'm going to, because a lot of people have pinged me about them, and I'm going to talk about them. So CircleCI, generally, whenever you push a commit, the job or the workflow starts running, right? And
right.
This is great at almost all times, except when you want to say, I want to have only one job or one workflow of a kind running, right? If you want a queue to literally limit, CircleCI is like, everything needs to be parallel, and I'm like 100%, except there are some tiny use cases when I don't want you to be so fast, right? And
sure.
That's basically what these 2 things are. So this lets you wait on a workflow. So this essentially means that you can make one workflow. You can say only one deploy workflow should ever be running at a time, right? So Circle will let you make sure that only you can serialize jobs within a workflow, but you cannot serialize workflows themselves. And this kind of just steps in and does that. You basically give it the name of the workflow that you want to wait for. The rest of it are all things that you want to modify. It doesn't really matter how it basically works on a polling mechanism. You just poll the workflow to see if the previous one is complete, and then it'll run yours. So by default, you can say wait for deploy workflows, and it'll wait for those.
So can I ask you if let's say, this is very useful for times when, I've had multiple workflows and I'm deploying, let's say, a fully tested packaged image for the app, but I'm still waiting on some other service to kind of come up, right? And so I have another workflow that, I need to trigger. And like you said, it triggers concurrently. So, and maybe the other service takes I don't know, let's say it's 30 seconds longer than the deployment one, right? So how do you sync that? And I guess this is your answer here, right? Is using the... was it wait for, what was it again?
Wait for workflow.
Wait for workflow. Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
now,
go for it.
Is that checking against the other workflow, right? So you would say
queues up all the workflows one by one. So it says the one that started first gets to go first. You put the name. So let's say there are 3, every commit merged to master deploys to staging. It'll be the first person who deployed, the first workflow that started is the first workflow that gets to deploy. And the place that we ended up using this at Bolt, and we have actually written a blog post about it on CircleCI at some point you should look up, is we use browser stack for our browser automation tests, but we have a parallelization limit of 10, right? And so we can only run 10 browser tests at a time, and each of our workflows is optimized to use all the 10 tests. So at this point, if 2 commits went into master, we're suddenly trying to use 20, and then both workflows fail. So what this guy does is it'll make sure that the second workflow does not start until the first one is done. So it makes sure that the other external resources, you can sync, basically block on your external resources.
Yeah, the way I was doing this was writing scripts, which is kind of what you're doing, calling back to the API basically like a long poll, and then once I get the status I'm looking for, right? then boom, right? Like, okay, now you can proceed. So, right, that's pretty cool that you already, and this is what I'm talking about, there's a lot of work that people have already kind of done and it's available out there. And this is why we're doing what we're doing, so that people can understand what's out there and then leverage it instead of reinventing the wheel. And the nice thing is, like, it's open source, so you can extend this. And if Roopak decides that, oh yeah, this is cool, maybe he can either incorporate it.
Yeah, and pretty open with like pull requests. So if you have any suggestions on things that can be improved, as long as it's backwards compatible, it's open.
Right. Yeah. No. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So this is like one of them, and then this is pretty much the same thing, except it's waiting for a job within your current workflow, which is also some things like exactly the case you were talking about. You want to wait in another job to be done before you want to start this. This is another thing that you can sort of end up doing. But yeah, these are the two most popular ones. You should sort of like explore. There's like things that publishes GitHub releases. There's something that check file size, because at some point in time we had someone who checked in a gigantic file by mistake, and GitHub shows binary files in small, and so nobody noticed, and they checked in a really big size. So we have this running against our repo, and I get what's the file size? Yeah, we have a size limit that you should add, something like, I don't want a file more than 1 MB in size or something, and it'll not block those files. But anyways, I'm going to get back to the one thing I wanted to talk about on MonoRepo, which I was talking about is, talking about checks. So let's sort of get into how we would do checks, right? So let's go and open up a pull request. I did push up a branch, right? So I'm not going to check this in, but let's say we did this, right? So GitHub has the feature to say, hey, so in this case, GitHub has protected branches, and you could, looks like, okay, yeah, GitHub has protected branches, and you could go and then say you need all these checks to pass. However, let's say you went and added the operations test as required, then nobody could ever nobody could check in code if it just touched client or server. That becomes a problem. Or if you modify, if you make server required and you modify only client code, then you cannot check in the code at all. So you have to now figure out how to make GitHub conditionally allow code to be checked in, right? And so the approach that we sort of went with is basically every workflow at the end makes a small CircleCI job that does nothing. It literally is a job that exists, which is called commit successful, right? So what happens is we wait only on the commit successful thing over here rather than waiting on operation. So let's kind of look at how one would set this up. Let's go to, I don't know, branch protection rules. Okay, so let's add a rule for master, right? So if we say for their master branch, require status checks to pass, right? If I say you need server and shared all the time, so if someone modifies operations, you can't get this, and then now it's going to be sort of blocked, right? So the sort of best way to go about this would be make a dummy job on Circle that does absolutely nothing, and then you just look for the commit successful, the presence of the commit successful job, and make that the only required thing.
So if you make a dummy job, though, you don't, I haven't done that, but do you get a pass or fail? How does that work?
Yeah, you actually do get a pass or fail.
Oh, right, because it exits 0 because nothing happened, right?
Exactly.
Okay, right. I got you.
So if, do you think it would be worthwhile like making a change now and then setting like this repo up to do that? Or do you think we would talk, like we could go into something else? I'm sort of like...
No, I think that's fine. I was just curious about the dummy job. So continue what you were going down the path you were going.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So generally you could just go in and then say, hey, both server and so I just gave some example. You can say both, like if both server and shared pass, you can have commit successful. And the most interesting thing here is you could decide to say, I don't care about the miscellaneous thing, even if it's very flaky. So even if it fails, I only care about lint and test. And if these two pass, I consider the commit successful to merge, right? So now you have different workflows that have a commit successful, and any one of these is just going to like be enough to sort of merge your branch, and you can have status checks on GitHub without like, without getting into like different problems of, oh, hey, how does this work with a monorepo sort of thing?
Sure. One question though. So now that we kind of covered, source code changes, right? Like, so when we're constituting a workflow, triggering jobs, we're basically, the idea there is, for the most part, the developers are just interested in their source code. But how do you handle, or how do you view handling when you have to, like, say I'm a developer and I made some changes. Let's go back. I'm a developer. I created a new feature, right, for the product. I built jobs and stuff for this, right? Take a step back. I just built the features. I want to add now my code into the whole process, right? The MonoRepo process, merge it into master. What we've been talking about here is like patterns for monorepos regarding source code and running CI against source code. What happens when I need to add this new feature into this monorepo? The config file is what I'm talking about. CircleCI config file now. What does that look like? Especially, I guess you've been doing this at Bolt, so I'm sure you have some insight into, you know what I mean? Like, what is like a normal or common pattern for a developer to also make a change, right, to not only the source code, but when they're ready to start, working with the config file and, implementing this new thing. So can you talk to that point a little bit?
Right. So one of the things which I've been sort of documenting, and I have to add like some documents around, is one, like at Bolt, our circle config is like over 2,500 lines.
Wow.
I mean, like, everybody.
But it could be a lot more without the orb, right?
It could be, and like though it's 2,500 lines, nobody actually touches that file. We have broken up. Circle has the CircleCI CLI, which lets you break up the orb in a different thing. So we have a file called trigger needed workflows that only has this piece. So we've broken up our YAML. Actually, I've written about it somewhere. I think it's on my blog. Yeah, okay, so here, I have an example of how you could break up your CircleCI CLI. And, SwizzKnife actually has a command where if you say, run this, it's going to take yours, like you can have many.
Can you zoom in on that a little bit?
Yeah, let me.
Sorry.
There we go.
A little bit more, man.
There you go. Better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, so if you run this command, what it's going to do is it's going to use a CircleCI CLI, and it's going to like compact your orb from multiple files into one file. So this way you're not like, so I'm going to be honest, YAML is really hard to understand. I'm not a huge fan, like, especially when the file goes like really big, it's hard. So this sort of takes it away. You look at it at a file structure. I think like humans are better at looking at small pieces of like small many files than like one gigantic file. So this sort of does that for you. It lets you have small files, and then okay, I guess I even have. There's an example.
With the CircleCI CLI, are you using like that pack command? So
yep, exactly. We use the pack command. So like I have a tiny example, or I had an example here. If you go into source, you can see how it's commands, executors, jobs, and workflows, right? So each one of these, like if you go into a command, this has only the command part of it. Right?
Sure, yeah.
And I think if you look over here, this guy finally uses the CircleCI command. So the only one thing to keep in mind, which developers forget a lot, and that's basically why I added this, is people make a change to the tiny files, and then they forget to generate the make config or pack again, And then they're like,
Right.
oh, I made a change, nothing happened.
It's not
And
showing
when you
up.
add this, yeah, they get a thing being like, hey, you modified your YAML, but you didn't like pack it up. So let's do this. So this basically does that, solve that problem. So this is like, as you get, a monorepo invariably means a lot of or a giant config file, and this sort of takes care of that.
Right, for sure.
Yeah. I forgot how we got here. We were talking about something else.
Yeah, so you were going down the three most common commands that people would use in your orb regarding monorepos. I think we covered the one, or at least that's where we left off before I went down a tangent.
Yeah, I think this one is like used quite a bit. Like I mentioned right now, the queuing one is like used a lot, and then finally the direct monorepo one is again used. There are other things where there's this one which sort of has been taken over the logic thing that Angel mentioned, the logic operations that they've added to YAML. However, there are certain things that the logic operation cannot do, so this still holds good. The logic operation cannot check if your files have been modified. So this sort of does that. If you say, hey, run this only if YAML files are modified, you can have this command which will do that for you. It'll run this code only if YAML files are modified. It does the same sort of check that we had before, but yeah.
Would it make sense to like, and I've had this conversation with folks, at some point we're developers. I like all my things in code, but there are some drawbacks, which is, like again, before orbs and the ability to encapsulate functionality, there was such a thing, or there is such a thing as too much code, right? And like you said, we're humans. We like to work on things at a smaller scale because I guess our brains, right? Some people can do it. I definitely like. I remember the old waterfall development days in the 90s when I was, writing code, and it was like massive. Right here, they just dumped the whole project on you, and you have to kind of sift through it all. Whereas today, I'm really glad that we're in this more of a, decomposed microservices kind of world, because it's bite size, right? And that stems from the agile kind of revolution that the industry went through. But with things like this, eventually, even by decomposing and encapsulating everything, you're still going to run into that kind of, I call it a sprawl, like code sprawl, pipeline sprawl, right? Where the volume of syntax is overwhelming. Mm-hmm. I don't care, what developer or any kind of programming language, it gets that way. But at some point, right, when you hit when you hit that point, graphical kind of interfaces, right, that abstract a lot of things kind of makes sense, right? So, right, a visualization type tools, and I'm just riffing here, like on some of my thoughts on how to avoid code, kind of the pipeline or code sprawl that I'm talking about. And I think, like I know Jenkins is really popular with folks because they can just like stand it up. Obviously, there's a lot of different configurations and advantages, disadvantages, but they really love that web page, right, to see the build, and then but everything else is managed. Even though there is now Jenkins files and all that, I get it, but it's still and it is a very robust system. Don't get me wrong; it can handle things like this a little bit easier, but again, it's a more dated, CI building tool versus the modern day stuff that just kind of easily blends into what I call the cloud native, structures that we use today. Okay, what are your thoughts on like visualization of these things? Is there a point where it makes sense, or is it just trash, or?
Oh, so I'm a huge fan. Okay, so I'm a visual person, right? Like, when I'm driving, my friends will be like, hey, here, I'll tell you where to take a right or a left. And I'm like, no, just put Google Maps on. I need to see it, right? Like, so that sort of
you're trained. You drank the Kool-Aid. Not just kidding.
yeah. So visualization is very important for me, and so like Circle makes it easy once the thing has been spun up. But like even tiny things, right? Like I know you can write a curl command to trigger a job, but like at Bolt, we have a lot of people who want to constantly trigger pipelines, and writing a curl command each time, saving it. You can do Postman and stuff like that, but it's not as helpful.
Sure.
Right. So in fact, like it's so much so it became a problem that I started like working on this. Let me see if so I started working on a backend tool that ties into like the Swiss knife orb. I'm still like growing this out, but if you want to trigger pipelines, you can actually just trigger pipelines.
Nice.
Like literally, you can type the name of the repo, you can add a bunch of parameters, and it saves it, and you can actually trigger it. So this is something that I use personally for my testing, but you can also use it for anything else. So this, along with I think the next thing that I'm building is webhooks. So
nice, cool. Yeah, so you're already kind of already down that path, right? Like, and by the way, if there's, for everyone listening, if there's any kind of features that are missing, or you feel really strongly about that you could benefit from, hit me up at Punt Data, or hit up at CircleCI Twitter, or however you socialize or contact companies. We're constantly monitoring that. We also have the Discuss site, which is our community kind of portal that you can actually get interaction with our teams and our community. So I'll just put that there, discuss.circleci.com, because that's what we're all about, is adding features that are helpful and useful for the community. We're building the tool, but we want to build a tool that's helps people get their jobs done easier, right, faster, and more reliably. So these are great ideas, and it's pretty interesting that you built a whole back end, which is another. I'm impressed that your head is in the game in automation and handling the different variety of trigger executions on CircleCI, which is pretty cool. But definitely, just for folks out there, hit us up on discuss.circleci.com. Obviously, Roopak is available too, right? Roopak, through pull requests or your Twitter handle. But awesome, man. Yeah. So, what else is there that you could show us regarding monorepos and like some of the? Or did you have some more in this topic? I wasn't sure if you were done.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, like we could go over like different things. I mean, let me see. What else have I found very interesting at this point?
So let me ask you this: what are the top issues you're getting in like, I guess, do you get issues in your? I'm assuming you get GitHub issues against this orb and stuff like that. What is like the top issue or that you're seeing, that you're experiencing?
Yeah, I think like so I also follow Discuss the CircleCI. So I see a lot of people posting issues there. I think some kinds of things that people end up asking for are like the conditional logic, but a lot more dynamic, right? And like I try and do stuff like this with this command, but it necessarily will not work, because people want to say, hey, I want to dynamically calculate something based off of that, maybe run this step. And like, even as an orb, it's sort of very hard for me to write that. I can, but it still doesn't look good for me to be able to write and then say, skip all other steps after this and things like that. So,
I found that like when people, I encounter folks like that too. And I find like there's in my advice, I have to be careful, because what will happen is, like, let's say it's totally possible, right? We're running automation. Let's say if I build a Python script to, handle that logic for me, and it's triggered by, some sort of parameter. But at that point, within YAML, how deep in, the logic the logical operations do you want to go? Again, it's a data structure, right? And we added these parameters to be able to be a lot more flexible and less opinionated than other tools out there. But at some point, right, you have to, I don't want to say cap it, but you have to kind of restrict yourself from that, from going too far down that rabbit hole.
Yeah,
right?
You don't want to make YAML a programming language.
Right. So like I've seen this, where I've seen this heavily is in the Ansible space, the Ansible tool.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever had experience with it. They use YAML and they have some, features within in their YAML that, kind of gives you some flexibility. But I've actually been in many conferences and workshops and sessions where like the Ansible people themselves are like, you guys are abusing these features, right? It's not a programming language, that was, and I think, knowing that myself, I kind of watch folks and certain patterns, right? That I want to make sure, we're not getting into that territory where like the Ansible or not organizers, but the contributors and maintainers are in right now. It's pretty amazing, and it's just human nature. We're like, oh, I can get everything done in Ansible. Meanwhile, is it the right choice? Like, right? I don't know, but I think it gets to the point where once you go down that rabbit hole, and you are now maintaining a whole subset of code just to manage your CI, I think, what I mean? Like I'm talking about like full on language. Like I'm doing Go to manage the logic in my CI/CD pipeline. It's kind of the same problem that I've seen with like other older CI tools, right? Java was like kind of the big thing, and actually Groovy is another one where people started just writing their pipelines in Groovy, and then when those folks who developed that pipeline left, some new people came in and like, what the hell is this? Like, well, I don't even know what Groovy is. And we're developers, right? That's okay. But on the same token, we're going to lose, some continuity is what I'm after, I guess.
So. I think that's very fair, right? Like this is the one thing that at least, so far I haven't I've tried, at least in this org, to stay away from like writing any like crazy things like what you're talking about. Like, if I feel like, okay, I'm going to write a Go binary to go do this, I'm like, yeah, that's a code smell. It might get hairy. Or it can be abused to go crazy. So, so far we haven't done that, but when we start getting there.
Yeah. No, right. So like I'm always of the opinion that there's no right or wrong. It's what, makes sense at the time. And that goes again right back to the thing we started talking about in the beginning about monorepos. Like, why are you implementing monorepos? Are you future proofing? Because if you are, right, that's great for how long? You know what I mean? There's an infinite amount of time that future proofing is gonna protect you. And then once you go down that road with, like we just talked about, creating a whole framework, I guess that's how new software is built, man. It's like, right, the deficiencies of some platform you're using. Oh, let me build this, and then eventually you'll have a whole different system that you didn't intentionally, or you weren't intentionally building, but it's serving the purpose, right? Anyway, weird thing, we went down a rabbit hole too, but I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that and how to control that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to control that, but I do think at some point you want to be you want your build pipelines to be, I don't know if this is the right word, elegant, right? You want it to be easy to understand on a quick glance.
Right. Yeah. And that's the philosophy if
someone understands the tool, they should.
That's the philosophy that we kind of push at CircleCI too. Is like, yes, we understand you have complex automation and things that need to get done, or maybe not complex, but there's a lot of intricate things that need to happen, and that's all good. But you also have to balance that with manageability, right? So then you're getting back to the point of why we created Orbs, is to have the ability to, centrally and easily manage functionality in your pipeline. So yeah, that's actually probably a good panel. Maybe we'll do a live stream with you and some other folks who have some strong opinions on monorepos, because It is a problem. I mean, I encounter people all the time, not necessarily with CircleCI, but with other tools, right? Like they're like, yeah, our code base is just way too big. I know, I don't want to say the company, but there's a really, I'll just say this: they're a huge company in the kind of engineering space. I'll just leave it at that. And they came to us and were like, hey, we want to write an orb for our product, which is like, great. Yeah, we want to, give our users as much capability as possible with their other vendors. But the problem was their code base was 10 gig. Right? So like you couldn't install it's basically a monolith that you could not install, a subsection of their product. So if they had a CLI, it's not like it's all or nothing. And again, going back to being able to manage that, I would like to see get some views. So maybe we'll do that in the future, a live stream, with like Monorepo battle streams. I don't know, or maybe just a pattern, right? Discussing different patterns and riffing on that.
10 gigs is huge.
Yeah, but that includes, excuse me. So it's an engineering tool. And that requires images, right? Mm-hmm. In certain cases. So that's where I think a lot of the bloat is. But also the tool is very old. I don't say old, but it's been around for a long time, very widely used, very popular. So, that also adds.
You got me really curious, Angel.
I'll tell you offline. But yeah, so so is there any other functionality that you wanted to cover or talk about? Or
what I generally want to do is I want to leave it here. I do want to tell people that October, or I think last year Circle called it Orbtoberfest. I think there's a general Hacktoberfest. I'm going to be opening up some issues on the Orb stuff. So if you want to learn to contribute, start jumping in, you should I'm gonna open up the Orbs thing so you can see it's GitHub/Roopak/V/Orbs. There are not too many issues. I'm gonna be adding a bunch of them, and I'm gonna label them as beginner issues. So jump
So wait
in.
a minute. Is this the Swiss knife orb?
Yeah, this is the Swiss knife orb repo. I named it Orbs. Okay. Because when I started out, I didn't understand Orbs really.
You're right, yeah.
By the time I'd already started publishing, and I was too lazy to change the name. So now it's just...
It's totally cool. You have that's why I was like, that's the one. Okay, just confirming. But this is, and thank you for kind of segueing into Hacktoberfest. So for those of you that don't know, Hacktoberfest was started by DigitalOcean as a way to highlight and engage developers and folks in the open source community to contribute, right, to open source in some way, shape, or form, whether it's updating some or patching code or updating code, all the way down to maybe contributing images to the project, or even updating documentation, right? That doesn't smell right, or is probably outdated. The Hacktoberfest event, we are sponsoring that again, and we will be. This is actually one of the kind of pre-October Hacktoberfest events that we're doing, and definitely want folks to contribute to anything open source, specifically Orbs, if you're interested. But yeah, Roopak, we're definitely going to promote some of this for Hacktoberfest, especially your project. I'm going to do a little digging myself when I get some time to get to know this Orb a little bit better, because I definitely like what you're doing here, and kind of showcase different dimensions, right, and different patterns people have. Because in general, I believe most of our customers are just doing the standard, right? Git push commit upstream, and then their workflows kick off. And to be honest, I think most of them even run a single workflow, in every pipeline build, right? So
yeah,
and that works if it works. But there's going to be points where, right, you're going to add features and products that are going to have, and maybe even processes that, like you were saying, deployment, right? I'm a big fan of smoke testing especially like Docker images, right? Just because you built it on one machine doesn't necessarily mean it's going to deploy properly in certain target environments, right? So one of my things is I'm a big fan of a smoke test, so I have smoke testing kind of steps built into or jobs built into my pipeline to make sure, right? Like, and that just gives you a little bit more, your release team and yourself as a developer, a little bit more confidence in that exact release, right? Like, so, hey, this thing ran in a Kubernetes cluster on GKE, EKS, or whatever, right? And it's just another stamp or seal of approval and check before, that thing goes into full production.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I mean, like, I think I've been talking to a couple of companies and I convinced them that, hey, if you guys move to multiple workflows per pipeline, you'll save a lot of cost and it'll be faster. I think they tried it and now they're hooked. So, it's a little bit of taking back and looking at your pipeline. So.
Well, that's one thing that, and we'll just end on this. One thing that I noticed as well is, and I tell people all the time, you can't just leave your config file untouched or at least unreviewed, right? Like a lot of, I speak to a lot of developers, even operations folks who are kind of responsible. They're just like, hey, it works. I don't need to touch it. And that may be true, but my advice is just because you don't need to touch it doesn't mean you shouldn't look at it, right? And kind of check it against your processes, because as your team grows, I can guarantee you those current build steps and processes, the way they're orchestrated, are not going to be efficient in the future, right? Yeah. Like there's going to be times where you're stepping over each other, just like you showed in that previous example with Git checks, right? Like you can step on each other and then that causes queues, and that's a whole nother animal that right, will slow you down. Yep. So I guess we're up on time. Hey, I want to appreciate. I want to say I appreciate you coming on with me today. I actually learned a shit ton of stuff today, which I'm super happy with, and I'm going to do a little bit more investigating on some of the work you're doing. And is there anything in closing that you wanted to add, Roopak, before we shut this thing down?
I don't know. Like, follow me on Twitter. Contribute to the orb. And
hey, so let me put your Twitter. So people, because normally. Like we could have put your Twitter handle in. Actually, can you rename your thing real quick down in the box?
Oh yeah, I can.
Just add yours, just so I don't have to do it. I'm making you work. There you go. So Roopak V at Roopak V on Twitter. So if anybody has any questions, just hit them up there. I guess, right? I mean, I'm not gonna manage your social media. I'm gonna follow him. Actually, I am following you. So
hit me up. And if you're looking for an interesting, if you're looking to do something interesting in engineering, also hit me up. Bolt is hiring. So
here we go. So is CircleCI. We're hiring. But seriously, I really appreciate you coming. I had a really good time. Also, let's go ahead and maybe do another one of these things, right? Soon, and maybe not MonoRepo-ish. Maybe we'll hack on some. Maybe that backend, is that backend open, or is that something?
No,
private?
It's not yet open, but I'm totally down to open it. The only reason I haven't open sourced it is because, I need to clean up a little bit of things. I don't have any tests.
I tell you what, that's okay, dude. It's got to start somewhere. So, in the future, book me down to let's explore that backend. I'm really interested in just not necessarily I guess we can get into the code, but more so like the functionality, right? Like some of the things that you're developing and the problems that you're solving with it. That's really interesting to me. I think a lot of other folks would be interested as well.
For sure.
Yeah, man.
All right.
Hey, so thank you, and again, I appreciate you being on the stream with me today and taking the time out of your business.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
All right, brother. All right. Thanks.